Hi, everyone, and good morning. Today I will discuss the social and behavioral sciences and ethics research related to HIV cure. My name is Karine Dube, and I'm an assistant professor in the UNC Gilling School of Global Public Health. I'm a social behavioral scientist who focuses on HIV cure research in the United States. I want to thank Julio for inviting me to present today on this wonderful topic. So first, let's start with the definition of HIV cure research. According to the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, HIV cure is any investigation that evaluates, one, a therapeutic intervention or approach that controls or eliminates HIV infection to the point that no further medical interventions are needed to maintain health, and two, preliminary scientific concepts that might ultimately lead to such a therapeutic intervention. So, as some of you know, there has been a massive investment in biomedical HIV cure research, with now over 240 clinical studies conducted around the world related to finding a cure for infection. You can find a list of those clinical studies on the Treatment Action Group, or TAG, website maintained by Richard Jeffries. So social and behavioral sciences are lagging behind biomedical HIV cure research efforts, although we are starting to make some progress in the United States and also in Europe and Australia and other places as well. Yet we have not tapped into the full potential of social and behavioral sciences and research methods, and we believe that behavioral and social factors can either facilitate or impede study conduct and also eventual uptake of interventions. For example, that is true even when there is acceptability and effectiveness, as we have seen with PrEP. So we need to start paying attention to the psychosocial factors in HIV cure. So HIV cure research is not one single strategy. It's actually a very complex field, and unlikely there will be one cure or a single magic bullet. And most likely we will need a combination of approaches. So for example, latency reversing agents aim at depleting the HIV reservoir, sort of knocking HIV out of its latent state and then making the cells being visible to the immune system. Most of these compounds are borrowed from oncology. Then we have a lot of strategies being investigated that aim at improving the immune system. There's also gene editing or modification approaches. And finally, stem cell transplantation, as we have seen with the Berlin patient, or Tim Brown, the only person cured of HIV infection. So most likely we will need a combination of approaches, and most HIV cure studies remain in early phases of investigation, and efforts will continue to be scaled up in the coming years. And most HIV cure research modalities are the proof of concept stage, and most likely we will need several research pathways that will intersect. Initial studies will use to pave future efforts, and most early studies will also have greater risks than benefits, and initial studies will also not be curative. So what makes HIV cure research distinct or unique? Well, HIV cure research is conducted against a background of highly effective antiretroviral therapy. Some, but not all, protocols ask people living with HIV to interrupt their treatment to help advance the science. And HIV cure research is also similar to other types of early phase research in that small HIV cure studies or experiments involve few participants. So we truly rely on the ethics of experimental medicine. We also have a dual role of patient participants and clinician researchers. We also need a high threshold of safety and efficacy. And as a social scientist, I will say we also need a high threshold of acceptability. Like cancer, a cure for HIV is limited by the persistence of rare, persistently infected cells, and this science is quickly evolving and complex. So a few of us have attempted to sort of map out how we can integrate the biomedical and the social science agenda around HIV cure. And of course, we need to make a clear difference between social behavioral research, ethics, community engagement, and implementation and translational science. These are different categories, and they're showed on this slide. So there was an initial framework by Dr. Cindy Grossman that was published in Trends in Microbiology in 2016. I recommend that you read this paper on integrating the biomedical and social science agenda around HIV cure. Here I have proposed an update of this model, and that's what I'll discuss today. So social behavioral sciences and early basic cure research can help us understand, for example, willingness to participate and take risks, as well as risk acceptability thresholds, including tolerance for side effects and treatment interruptions, acceptable and unacceptable risks, acceptable and unacceptable target product profiles, participant experiences, and also the willingness of HIV physician to refer participants into studies. There's been a rich literature already from Europe by Dr. Christine Protière and also Bruno Speer and Marie-Suzanne Monti in France that have recognized the dual role of patient participants and also clinician and researchers. And they've also attempted to use more innovative approaches as well, including the Q methodology, which you see on the top right, and also discrete choice experiments. So there's already some really wonderful work happening in Europe on this topic. And also Ruth Simmons has published a global survey of HIV-positive people's attitudes towards HIV cure research. This work is being done in the UK. So I will focus more about the work that we have been doing here in the United States. My collaborator is David Evans from Project Inform. And David has done several surveys by now, including with Fred Verdult from Amsterdam. And what you see on this slide was actually our second survey on willingness to participate and take risks in HIV cure research. And here we focused on perceived risks and benefits of HIV cure research. And most of the recruitment was done online using HIV treatment and cure listservs. And obviously, our sample was not representative of the community of people living with HIV in the US. But we looked at perceptions of risks and benefits and how that would motivate participation in cure research. Here you see the importance of factors that would motivate considering participating in a cure study. And the potential personal benefits are the highest motivators, including feeling good about contributing to HIV cure research, getting knowledge about one's health, and learning about new treatment options. There's also a potential perceived clinical benefits, including the ability to better fight HIV infection, controlling viral load in the absence of treatment, and then interestingly, reducing the HIV reservoir in the body, although we know that a reduction in the HIV reservoir may not have any direct clinical benefit. And then, of course, there are tremendous societal benefits of participating in cure research, including helping find a cure for HIV, helping other people with HIV in the future, and contributing to scientific knowledge. So that speaks to the role of altruism in HIV cure research. We also looked at the likelihood of factors that would discourage participation in HIV cure-related research, and here potential personal clinical risks, for example, activation of genes that could cause cancer, the possibility of developing resistance to drugs, and toxicities or adverse negative effects of drugs would be important deterrents. We also looked at acceptability of specific study procedures, for example, spinal tap, bone marrow biopsies, and biopsies of lymph nodes and rectal biopsies, which appear to be the least favorite types of procedures. And we also looked at specific burdens of participation. So we found that helping people with transportation needs was a very important facilitator to participation. And then finally, in terms of societal risks, the risk of transmitting HIV to a sexual partner was the most important deterrent to having someone participate in a cure study. So that's something that we should closely monitor in future years, as well as stigma and discrimination and being recognized as a person living with HIV. So we also looked at the willingness to consider participation in different types of HIV cure studies. So surveys, basic blood draw studies, interviews, and focus groups had very high willingness. But then when we started looking at higher risk studies, there was decreased willingness to participate in cure studies. So for example, allogeneic stem cell transplants and latency reversing agents would be the least popular types of HIV cure studies. So as we move forward with the field, we'll need to pay attention to the types of studies that people are willing to enroll in, and this can also differ by gender, for example, and there could be group differences. We also looked at willingness to participate in studies and perceptions of benefits and motivators using bivariate and multivariate analyses. Here, we looked at whether a person's perceptions of potential benefits or risks affected their willingness to participate in HIV cure studies that had higher risks interventions. So we asked respondents to rate 21 potential benefits in terms of how important they considered each benefit to be and their motivation to participate. We also asked them to rate 35 potential risks and how likely they might discourage them from being willing to participate in studies. We converted the results into dichotomous variables, and we ran multivariate logistic regressions to determine the association of people's perceptions of benefits and risks on willingness to participate in 6 different HIV cure study types. And we also controlled for various social demographic and health status characteristics. So we ran one model for each of the 21 benefit variables and one model for each of the 35 risk variables. And the 6 types of HIV cure studies that we looked at were latency reversing agents, allogeneic stem cell transplants, autologous stem cell transplants, therapeutic vaccines, special molecules or antibodies, as well as gene modifications. And what you see on this slide are the summary results for the perceptions of the 21 potential benefits as very important motivators to participation. And each cell shows a separate unique model. And what you see are only the odds ratios of the key independent variables that were statistically significant at the 0.05 level or less. And to make it easier to compare the magnitude of the odds ratios, we created a heat map of the results. So for example, respondents who rated feeling good about contributing to HIV cure research as a very important motivator were 5.69 as likely to be willing to participate in allogeneic stem cell transplant studies than respondents who rated that particular benefit as less important, controlling for other variables. Here, all the odds ratios were greater than 1 as we expected. So benefits contribute to willingness to participate in studies. The darker the green, the greater the odds ratios. Perceptions that helping find a cure for HIV is a very important motivator had an odds ratio of 14.21. So these respondents were 14 times more likely to be willing to participate in a gene modification studies than others to whom helping find a cure for HIV was not at all important. And something interesting about these perceived benefits, again, here it's perceptions of benefits. It may not reflect actual benefit, but it's really important to understand how people living with HIV perceive these different modalities. Here, reducing the HIV reservoir was statistically significant for latency reversing agents, although, again, we know that this HIV cure studies has not been associated with a substantial reduction in the size of the HIV reservoir to date, although the science continues. So as we move forward, we'll need to clearly and carefully manage and clarify expectations as we move forward with the science. We also ran the same types of regressions using perceptions that particular potential risks was very likely to discourage participation as the key independent variables. We used willingness to participate in the same 6 types of studies as the dependent variable, and we controlled for same individual level characteristics. So for the perceptions of risks, the odds ratios were less than 1. This confirms the negative correlation between perception of risk as very likely to discourage and willingness to participate. And this makes sense because people who are doing really well and people who are more risk averse are generally less likely to take part in intensive and risky HIV cure studies to begin with. This also shows that in the future, there will probably be a low risk tolerance for otherwise healthy volunteers for HIV cure research. So a potential cure will need to be very safe. And also it looks like nearly every risk factor is important here. However, by the gradation of the red, we can see that there are classes of risks that are more significant in magnitude than others. For example, potential personal clinical risks, as well as potential risky study procedures like spinal tap, bone marrow biopsies, are most significant in magnitude than other types of risks, like intensive study commitments, blood draws, organ donation after death, symptoms except for nausea, burdens, and other potential social risks. So this research can inform study teams on which potential risks to mitigate in HIV cure studies and emphasize in informed consent forms. So although there's a very high willingness to participate in studies, we need to pay attention to how both risks and benefits are perceived and how they either motivate or deter participation. And willingness data do not always reflect actual revealed preferences, the inclusion-exclusion criteria of studies, and the actual studies or protocols that participants would actually qualify for. The findings also underscore the need to better educate potential volunteers about potential risks of HIV cure studies. We also need to better understand the role of altruism in high-risk and low-benefit studies. So while the results should not be used to predict enrollment rates in studies, the responses and social behavioral research in general can inform study design, including understanding of risks and benefits, as well as considerations for informed consent and recruitment efforts. And in the future, we will also need more research about factors affecting participation in specific types of studies, as well as in more diverse populations. So that is why David Evans from Project Inform and myself have tried to expand the social and behavioral science agenda around HIV cure. David Evans received a small grant from Gilead Sciences to start engaging more women and people of color in HIV cure research. And our more recent study looked at risk acceptability thresholds and desirable target product profiles of a potential HIV cure research regimen. So here we will show preliminary descriptive results of our 2018 survey, and David and I are now working on the bivariate and multivariate results, as well as the qualitative analyses, and we hope to submit to IAS 2019. So here in our 2018 survey, we asked respondents to tell us what they would find to be most meaningful in a potential HIV cure research regimen. So how much of an improvement each item would represent over current daily medication. And here we focused on life-changing improvements in dark blue. Looking at the aggregate results in the top 3 categories, having no more replication-competent HIV inside the body or classic cure, no longer taking daily medication, and more confidence in not passing HIV to others would be the most important life-changing improvements. But as we were examining the results, we also became interested in the categories that would represent no improvement at all in bright red. These seem to be more prominent at the bottom of the graph, and they pertain to psychosocial factors. They also show that stigma are still very pervasive for a lot of people in the community. So while the biological factors of a potential cure regimen would be the most important perceived improvements, if we are not addressing the psychosocial aspects of what an HIV remission may offer, it may not be as life-changing. We also ask respondents to tell us to consider yourself in remission. How long would you have to be off your ARV without having your virus come back? And here we only show the aggregate results. 26% of respondents would need at least 1 year off therapy, 21% would need at least 3 years, and 15% would need more than 5 years. So that may be an important for our definition of HIV remission or virologic suppression of therapy, and we perhaps should consider the patient participant perspective. We tend to use the 5-year mark for virologic suppression of therapy, which is borrowed from the oncology model, and it may not apply exactly to an HIV remission regimen. And here we ask specifically about different desirable scenarios for an HIV remission regimen. Most items started with the premise: how likely would you be to choose a new HIV remission strategy over standard daily medication if the following? And again, we started analyzing the categories in blue, but we also became quickly interested in the items to the left of the blue box. So in the aggregate results, 46% would be very likely or moderately likely to switch to an HIV remission regimen if it meant no more daily pills, but having to visit the clinic more often for monitoring. And this was followed by 45% of respondents who would switch if the new HIV remission regimen caused side effects initially, but these eventually went away. And looking at the non-blue, 45% would not switch if the HIV remission regimen would not increase their quality of life, and close to 60% would be unlikely to switch if there were any risk that they could transmit HIV to another person. So we also looked at acceptable trade-offs or acceptability of factors whether a new HIV remission strategy compared to experiences with standard ART. Overall, 61% of respondents would not mind having injections or infusions every few weeks. 53% would even be willing to undergo some sort of pain. But when we looked at the bright red, changes in mental health status were most prominent in the unacceptable category. And again, that is an area that is ripe for further research. And here we ask specifically about preferences for daily ART versus long-acting ART injectables and versus remission. Respondents had to choose one option. So when presented with multiple scenarios, 9% overall would stay on their daily ART. 42% would prefer a version of their current ART, but taken at 6 months interval, and 24% would prefer an HIV remission regimen. So the graphs here also show that in the future, we will need to be able to provide a variety of options to people living with HIV. And we'll also need to be able to keep asking those questions as the science evolves. And when we disaggregated the data by gender, men appeared more willing to try a novel HIV remission regimen, and women appear less willing to rock the current boat. So that's something we'll need to pay attention to moving forward. We'll need to pay attention to gender and sex differences. We've also been interested at the intersection of social behavioral research and community and stakeholder engagement or perceptions of the science. So we did conduct several key informant interviews, and our qualitative analysis revealed 4 key main findings, including that potential HIV study volunteers wanted more information and education about potential risks of HIV cure research. Biomedical HIV cure researchers, policymakers, and bioethicists showed less awareness of social and financial risks of HIV cure research than people living with HIV. Most respondents also across the different categories of informants identified some risks that were too great to be acceptable in HIV cure research, although a subset of people living with HIV did not place an upper limit on acceptable risks. And people living with HIV showed a much better awareness of potential psychosocial benefits of participating in HIV cure research as well as psychosocial risks. And the paper provides considerations regarding the management of risks and benefits in HIV cure-related research. This slide shows the category of what is too much risks, and here we also collected the perspective of biomedical HIV cure researchers and policymakers, regulators, and bioethicists. And some of these risks appear to meet the criteria for serious adverse events in those protocols, including hospitalization, debilitation, disability, and death. So this would correspond to the category of too much risks in HIV cure research. So again, there's a lot of variability here, and it's important to pay attention to the perceptions of people living with HIV, particularly since most people are doing very, very well on treatment. So the threshold of safety and efficacy has to be very high to move these interventions forwards in humans. We also conducted focus groups in major US cities about HIV cure research, and we found an overall distrust for functional cure. Some thought it was like an oxymoron and had a very hard time visualizing this functional cure. And there was a strong preference for classic cure in our focus groups. This paper is published in AIDS Research in Human Retroviruses if you are interested in finding out more. There were also concerns with the word remission borrowed from oncology, so we propose using words like durable suppression or virologic suppression of therapy to describe the science. This slide shows a poster that was just presented at the United-sponsored workshop on HIV cure in Bethesda, Maryland, in the United States. Here we looked at acceptability of cell and gene therapies as an approach for curing HIV, and we did qualitative research among people living with HIV. So there were some really interesting findings here. Again, we saw risk aversion among people living with HIV, and several concerns that people had about HIV cell and gene therapy, particularly because it has to do with modifying genes, and a lot of concerns around analytical treatment interruptions. And also the focus groups highlighted the needs for much better education and information around this modality. Okay, so now we're moving on to ethical considerations in early basic HIV cure research. So ethics is really the study of what ought to be done. And ethics in early basic cure research can help us assess the ethics of interrupting treatment, modality or model-specific considerations, as well as considerations for combining regimens, the ethics of consent, real-time integrative ethics, ethics of incentives, as well as the ethics of translating cure research discoveries, and ethical considerations in moving cure research discoveries through the regulatory pathway. So there's been a really great literature on this so far. We have a lot more work to do, but this is really an emerging area of research. So again, ethics is what ought to be done, and it helps us identify, analyze, and even resolve conflicts of value, because research with human participants will involve values, and these can sometimes conflict. This slide shows how medical ethics, research ethics, and public health ethics are different and intersect with each other. So they show different types of care. For example, with medical ethics, we care for patients. In research ethics, we care for study participants. And in public health ethics, we care for populations. So in terms of medical ethics, there are 4 principles that apply to medicine, including autonomy, non-maleficence, doing no harm or minimizing the harm, beneficence, trying to do good, and justice. And research ethics relates to the researcher-participant interaction and governs the conduct of research. The Belmont report highlights some of the key principles, for example, beneficence, respect for persons or autonomy, and justice or fair representation in research. And then finally, public health ethics is newer and relates to making decisions that support a public health mandate. So all 3 domains are important in HIV cure-related research, with perhaps an emphasis on research and medical ethics. But with analytical treatment interruptions, for example, this involves all 3 domains of ethics. So we want to care for patients. We also want to care for participants in research. We also have to care for populations, for example, trying to prevent the emergence of drug resistance, for example, during these ATIs. So we have to anticipate potential issues that may arise while still trying to advance the science. So there are several values in research ethics. In HIV cure-related research, more specifically, Bernie Lowe and Christine Grady published a really great paper in Current Opinions in HIV/AIDS in 2013. I recommend reading this paper for an overview of these values in research ethics, including the need for scientific validity, social value, potential for scalability of interventions, and the fair selection of participants, as well as maintaining a favorable risk-to-benefit ratio, ensuring informed consent, ensuring that communities are adequately engaged at all stages of the research, and finally, ensuring independent review. Jeremy Sugarman later expanded these considerations, including assessing risk to others or third-party risks, for example, risk to sexual partners during treatment interruptions, as well as non-financial and financial conflicts of interests and media attention. There's also an emerging literature around the ethics of informed consent in HIV cure-related research. Dr. Gail Anderson from UNC Chapel Hill analyzed 13 informed consent forms and found a lot of variations and deficiencies in some of these consent forms that merited attention. So, for example, consent forms must convey the lack of clinical benefits, and surrogate endpoints should not be presented as a possible medical benefit. Also, we should differentiate the purpose of this study or a specific study, for example, reducing reservoirs, with a long-term goal of the research, which is to induce virologic suppression of therapy. Some individuals have actually advocated for not using the word cure in any of those informed consent forms. There's also an emerging literature around resolving the risk and benefit ratio challenge in HIV cure research. There was actually a special issue in the Journal of Medical Ethics in early 2017 on this topic if you are interested. So the assessment of the risks and the benefits are two of the main hallmarks in any ethical decisions to approve clinical research. So research risks must be minimized and acceptable in relation to the prospective benefits to study participants or of the knowledge to be generated. There could also be unexpected clinical benefits in HIV cure research. For example, some of the Sangamo-type trials have been associated with a benefit to the participants' baseline immune functions. So we could see that intermediate benefits short of a cure may also emerge. And as we move forward, we will also need to be able to define those intermediary benefits or successes. Most of my work is focused on looking at this category of otherwise healthy volunteers. So the U.S. Food and Drug Administration considers people living with HIV as being otherwise healthy for the purpose of assessing risks and benefits. So that's why they tend to be very conservative when it comes to the risk involved in these studies. They have even put clinical trials on hold because they were deemed to not be safe enough for people living with HIV. As we move forward with HIV cure research, we will also need to appreciate modality-specific and model-specific considerations. So there are a number of papers now published on ethical considerations in the context of specific HIV cure research strategies. For example, Jeremy Sugarman provided considerations for when treatment interruptions following stem cell transplantations would be ethically appropriate. Similarly, Seema Shah argued that experimental stem cell transplantation should not be conducted in children due to the relatively high risks involved in these interventions. And for pediatric HIV cure research, we probably require a separate framework than for adults. And more recently, we did write a manuscript on ethical considerations for HIV cure-related research at the end of life. So I was the lead author on that paper, but we had tremendous community input, including from Jeff Taylor and Andy Cates at the University of California, San Diego. There's a new study called The Last Gift, where people living with HIV who are terminally ill, not dying of HIV, but dying of another cause, for example, stellate cancer, may participate in HIV cure research and literally donate their entire body to the science. So if you are interested in this paper, you can find it in BMC Medical Ethics. I believe there's also similar work being done in Europe as well. So now, also as we move forward, there will be a non-precedented convergence between various types of HIV cure strategies. We do not yet know what a cure will look like. And an effective HIV cure will likely require a combination of approaches, for example, drugs or biologics. And this may increase the risks above standard antiretroviral therapy. So we'll need to consider the ethics of combining different regimens. There should be a really clear rationale for the regimen, the dosing, the intervals, and so on. We've also been interested in how these ethical considerations intersect with community perceptions. there is no topic that is more controversial than analytical treatment interruptions. In fact, there are no established tests to predict the likelihood of imminent rebound, and the ultimate test for an HIV remission will be the interruption of treatment in a carefully controlled research environment. And also, treatment interruptions are only getting better. So there's been little consensus to date on when ATIs would be ethically warranted. And a team of us have tried to describe potential scientific and ethical considerations in HIV cure research. This paper was published in the Journal of Virus Eradication in 2017 and looks at considerations around the scientific utility of ATIs, risk thresholds, participant selection, study design and monitoring, as well as informed consent. More recently, the Reagan Institute in Boston organized a meeting earlier this year on a consensus workshop for treatment interruptions. And the organizers are currently working on a manuscript, so we look forward to seeing that paper. Also, Richard Jeffries from Team Action Group did look at community perceptions around ATIs, so his report should also be available very soon as well. Most of my work is focused on perceptions and ethics of analytical treatment interruptions in HIV cure research. So this paper, published in AIDS Research and Human Retroviruses last year, looks at main motivators to undergoing ATIs, as well as main concerns from various types of stakeholders, critical safeguards and considerations that should be in place, as well as implications of those findings. And we'll need to have continued dialogue and evolving consensus around ATIs. Participant safety will need to remain the priority. We will also need to appeal to the scientific altruism of study participants. There are currently several unmet needs of participants who undergo ATIs. We need to continue research on a home-based auto-test for viral load testing, as well as consider the psychosocial aspects of undergoing ATIs and providing PrEP for sexual partners of those who undergo treatment interruptions. There's also been an evolving literature around critical aspects of community and stakeholder engagement. Stakeholder engagement in early cure research remains in its early stages and involves different factors, including community advisory boards, as well as broader community engagement, data dissemination in lay terms, and the public understanding of science. And obviously, more work could be done on the intersection of community engagement and ethics, as well as the role of good participatory practice guidelines in the context of early phase cure research. This work has looked at framing and managing expectations, as well as the role of language in early basic cure research. So in this paper, we looked at framing cure research as experiments to show that they have very limited clinical benefits. There's also an emerging literature around the ethics of talking about cure research. And with several colleagues, we also published a paper in BMC Public Health about the use of the word eradication in HIV cure-related research. On a population perspective, this may be misleading. There's also an emerging literature on the social meaning of HIV cure research, particularly in China. One study was done among people who inject drug. Here, the possibility of being cured renewed patient hope for regaining physical well-being and achieving social mobility. However, the existence of a cure may not alter the HIV-related stigma due to its associated with stigmatized behaviors in marginalized groups. And a cure may exacerbate perceived health disparities if it is inaccessible to those affected, for example, people who inject drugs. The second study here showed that different representation of cures could exist. So people living with HIV may thought that a cure was a distant possibility for them. And the ideas around a possible cure range from optimism to skepticism and even pessimism. And some participants also describe that they've adjusted very well to the chronic condition of HIV and ART adherence. And then finally, the role of translational and implementation science. We need to ensure that strategies are truly scalable and effective in the real world. So this is where social behavioral sciences can also contribute to external validity of the findings and finding about effectiveness in the real world. We also need to ensure the recruitment and retention of diverse and underrepresented populations in research to ensure that the data can be generalizable. So some other work in that category has related to synergies between HIV prevention, treatment, and cure, as well as removing barriers to HIV remission research in low and middle income countries, looking at the role of comorbidities in HIV cure research, and adopting a naturalist approach that accounts for the likelihood that a cure will be low cost, scalable, and easy to administer worldwide. Most of my work has consisted in looking at the entire continuum of clinical and translational science, so adopting a translational ethics lens to anticipate some issues that may arise at different stages of the translational research pathway. For example, T0 pertains to targets, biomarkers, genes, pathways, and mechanisms. T1 are first in human studies, like what Tim Brown had, the Berlin patient, or proof of concept experiments, or early phase trials. Then T2 would be larger scale trials trying to look more at efficacy. T3 would be clinical application, so moving cure research into the real world. T4 would be public health applications, really looking at populations. And then T5 would be moving a cure to a global setting. So this is the paper, Research on HIV Cure, Mapping the Ethics Landscape. It was published in PLOS Medicine last year. So we try to anticipate different issues at different stages of the translational research pathways. If you are interested, I highly recommend that you read the paper. So again, we will need to make sure that development of a cure aligns with and even raises the bar for the field of HIV control as a whole. So we need to overcome the prevention, treatment, cure silos and see this as a continuum. So for example, with HIV prevention research, we're trying to prevent the establishment of the HIV reservoir. But with cure research, we're trying to deal with that reservoir. And we want to make sure that everyone who is infected is on treatment and virally suppressed, because most people who would qualify for cure-related studies will need to be virally suppressed. So when we talk about HIV cure research with our communities, we also talk about treatment cascade issues and also about prevention. So this is a slide that I've used about why social and behavioral sciences. David Evans and I have been advocating quite a lot here in the United States to include social and behavioral sciences as part of HIV cure research. And this is our slide that shows why we need this. And we can talk about all the benefits of including social and behavioral sciences. We can also talk about the risks of not doing this. So maybe that's something that we could discuss together as a community. You may also be familiar with the CUREiculum effort, which was a training program that was aimed at increasing literacy around HIV cure-related research and making HIV accessible to the community in the HIV research field. This can be found on the AVAC website, although it hasn't been updated in a while. The last time it was updated was 2015. So we need to update this tool so it can remain relevant. This slide shows different resources that we have here in the United States that may be helpful to you guys in Europe. So I highly recommend the Cure Glossary from Project Inform. It can be found in English and Spanish. Treatment Action Group also has a really wonderful HIV cure webpage that lists different trials being done on HIV cure around the world. Positively Aware also maintains a blog on HIV cure. Pause Magazine also has an HIV cure page, as well as the body. And then the International AIDS Society Towards an HIV Cure also has an entire initiative. And you can find most presentations from past meetings on there. Again, a reminder that community involvement, community stakeholder input in HIV cure research is one of the critical safeguards in clinical research, to make sure that the community is behind those trials and supports analytical treatment interruptions. So it's important to build the capacity of communities to participate in HIV cure research, dialogues, and discussions, and also to contribute to the science. Community can contribute also scientifically to the research to make sure that we can do this both safely and effectively. And then this is my last slide. I want to thank you all for listening. I hope you all enjoy the 2018 Glasgow HIV meeting, and we wish you a wonderful meetings from your friends in the US. Thank you all so much.